Hello, Health Psych students. Gosh, I wish I could see all of y'all in the classroom. I would much rather prefer to interact with you that way, but we are in weird times with this COVID pandemic, and so we are going to do the best that we can. This lecture is the first part of the smoking lecture, which is the last lecture before your second exam. And so let me pull up the PowerPoint here, and I will work off of the PowerPoint. And then I will create a forum as you learn. If you've got any questions, after you either watch this and listen to it and see the PowerPoint, I'll put all three up on As You Learn. I'll put a file up there. That's the PowerPoint. I'll put a file up there. That's the MP4, which is the video. And the video is going to show the PowerPoint. And then I'll also put up an audio version for those of you who are in internet circumstances where that's all you can do is listen to one and actually look at the PowerPoints on the other and not the combined case. And I will be in touch about the second exam and how we're going to deal with that online also. Okay, so what's the one behavior that causes the most morbidity and mortality? And you got it. It is cigarette smoking. You all know that we have talked over and over again in this class. If we had a magic wand where we could change one health behavior at a time here in the United States, if we were able to get all of the people who use tobacco to quit using tobacco. And so I'm talking about cigarette smoking, I'm talking about dip and chew, and then I'm also going to be talking about vaping some in this lecture. If we get all of them to quit, that would have the biggest impact on improving the health of people in the United States. That's number one. Number two would be sedentary lifestyle, and number three would be nutrition. Okay, so we have a very long history of scientists and understanding the link between cigarette smoking and problems with health. So all the way back to the 1930s. It's the #1 preventable cause of disease and death, which is why, again, magic wand, that would be the behavior we want to target. Don't worry so much about the raw numbers of death, but I do want you to know that we've got deaths per year, illness and deaths from people who smoke from their own injury and damage, as well as quite a few individuals that are dying due to secondhand smoke, who are not smokers themselves or inhaling other people's smoke. Dana Reeve, who was featured, she was the narrator on the New Medicine documentary. And when she made that documentary, she herself was sick with lung cancer, and she believes she got lung cancer because she was exposed to smoke, other people smoking, but was not a smoker herself. So the tobacco industry is a huge social, political, economic issue, especially for those of us who live in the tobacco growing states here in the South, North Carolina definitely being one of them, Virginia, South Carolina, or the others. We in the US are the largest producers of tobacco, and it's grown not in just our 3 states, but 16 states, but most focused right here. Philip Morris has about 50% of the market share as an example, so very powerful company. I wanted to show you, if you'll look at the top right, the Winston package there. When I was in Mexico, I took a bunch of pictures of their cigarette labels because they make the warning really big and just direct. It's just right there. So smoking causes fatal lung cancer, right on the packet. They legally have to put that. Our warning in the United States is real teeny tiny, and it's not nearly as powerful. Okay, so from an epidemiological standpoint, 19% of US adults smoke, about 15% of high schoolers. And actually the smoking in high schoolers is at an all-time low, but that is because a lot of high schoolers are vaping instead. 24% are using e-cigarettes. That is at an all-time high. We'll focus on vaping in another slide here in a moment. There has been a decrease in smoking in men. There has been an increase in smoking in women, and that has resulted from the tobacco industry's deliberately marketing to women based on their body image vulnerability, and kind of implicating in their advertising that cigarette smoking can help women either control their weight or can help them control their weight and control their body image. We know that people who are of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to be smokers. So to put it bluntly, the poorer poorer people in the United States are the ones that do the most tobacco use, both the chew and the dip and the smoking. I don't have SCS data on the vaping at this point in time. And this has implications for all of us is when we start thinking about Medicare that pays for healthcare for 65 and older, we start thinking about Medicaid that pays for healthcare per state by the state supported tax base, depending on where the poverty level is determined to be at an individual state. These are oftentimes individuals that are either uninsured or underinsured. And so here we have this group of individuals that are engaging in a very unhealthy habit, who tend to be the have-nots in terms of healthcare. And so that is an interesting dilemma for all of us because our taxpayer dollars help assist them with healthcare. So more likely to see blue collar, pink collar individuals as opposed to like professionals, white collar, to be consumers of tobacco products. From a cost perspective, about 12% of our total U.S. Health expenditure is attributable to smoking. As we talked about earlier in the semester, we do not have enough funds, or we are wasting funds in our healthcare system. And this is one of the places where if we needed savings in our healthcare system, we could save so much money if people stop with the tobacco habit. The 183 billion in economic losses, I wouldn't worry too much about these raw numbers, but I do want to focus a little bit, and I want you to know that about half of that is direct medical costs. So medical costs covering people who've been injured from cigarettes, and the other half is lost productivity. So individuals, because of their illness and their disability from smoking, are unable to be productive and unable to work. And so the costs come in a couple different angles. So the politics of state-provided healthcare. So remember, Medicaid is state-provided healthcare for people who are poor, and poor is defined however that state defines their poverty level. And so what has ended up happening in recent history is we had a lot of politicians start to get really concerned that both through Medicare, our federal healthcare, and our Medicaid, our state funds coming out of all the individual states, that we taxpayers were spending a lot of money paying for individuals who were injured, sick from tobacco use. And so these politicians got together, and I'll go ahead and let me go to the next slide. Let's talk about, let's look at the advertising first, then we'll talk about the master settlement agreement. Isn't this fascinating how advertising used to look when it came to cigarettes? We've got the doctor who prefers Camel. Your doctor is telling you this is the cigarette he smokes. We got the pregnant one. My gosh, I hope my mom didn't do this to me. We've got pregnant women. We've got the women playing tennis. Nothing goes with good tennis and exertion like smoking. Say Ronald Reagan down here. I don't know if you all remember him as president, but he was an actor before he became president of the United States, and then he passed away of Alzheimer's. He was acting and posing in this ad. Santa Claus is a cigarette smoker. Can you imagine how long it would take Santa to deliver packages all over the world if he had to stop for smoke breaks? And then down here, I just mentioned the women's marketing. Virginia Slims tagged on to the third wave of the feminist movement. And they were very, very successful in this advertising campaign, getting a lot of women to smoke. And their phrase was, "You've come a long way, baby." Meaning you've come a long way with the feminist movement. You've been empowered, you're rising in your salaries and your politics, all that kind of stuff. You come a long way, baby. You deserve to be able to enjoy cigarettes very much like men do. And interestingly, some of the ads would talk about how, your husband might not approve, your dad might not approve, but you've come a long way, baby. We're giving you permission to smoke cigarettes. And they came up with Virginia Slims, and there's no accident in that. The Virginia Slim part was trying to emphasize that if you smoke cigarettes, you would be lean, which fits with our cultural ideal. And so it was both a brilliant campaign and then a horribly damaging campaign, because so many women wanted to be like this sassy, lovely, lean, she's come a long way, baby kind of person. And a lot of women picked up cigarette smoking. Okay, so back to the politics. The late Senator John McCain, he died only recently. He was a Republican from Arizona who actually did a really wonderful job in his political reign of getting people on both sides of the aisle, getting Republicans and Democrats to work together. And the master settlement agreement he led, very good at getting co-sponsorship in this master settlement agreement. And what he negotiated was between 46 states in the US and the tobacco industry, that the tobacco industry would have to be paying out to these states across 25 years, $209 billion to help these states recover funds to fund their Medicaid costs for all of the Medicaid patients that they had paid for who had been injured from cigarette smoking. And the reason why the tobacco industry agreed to do this is they had been caught between the time when we talked about, remember they were called to Congress years before this, and they lied and lied and lied. They said, no, nicotine's not addictive. Meanwhile, they had chemists back at home trying to make the nicotine more addictive. They said, no, you can't prove with the scientific method that cigarettes has any harm to human beings. When, remember in Bloom's criteria that we covered in epidemiology, oh, yes, you can. You can in animal models do the true scientific experiment. And with the human research, you meet all of Bloom's criteria so that you are very confident in an assumption of causality, even for humans, even though you can't do the true scientific experiment. So they lied about nicotine, they lied about the health consequences, and the third thing they lied about is they were asked, are you advertising and trying to get children to smoke? And they're like, oh no, you know, if you're 18 and you are legally able to buy cigarettes and enjoy the pleasure of cigarettes, then go buy them. Meanwhile, they had back at home in their marketing and advertising teams, they were running focus groups with kids and finding out what kinds of advertisement kids would pay attention to and what kind of advertisements kids would not pay attention to. And that's how Joe Camel was born, because they learned that kids were a lot more likely to pay attention to a cigarette advertisement that had a cartoon character on it than a cigarette advertisement that had a human being, a picture of a human being on it. So they lied and they lied and they lied. And then finally this caught up to them. The politicians realizing this caught up. And so these tobacco companies were penalized for their deceptive practices. Now, in a settlement, you've got both sides agree that they're getting something out of it. And what the tobacco industry got out of it is, before this settlement agreement, individuals who were injured could individually sue tobacco companies and get compensation for their injury. And at the time, the lawsuits were going really well for the complainants, the people who had been injured. So you had these individual lawsuits, you had class action lawsuits, these big groups of people who had been injured banding together. They were quite successful in suing the tobacco industry. So the tobacco industry was losing a lot of money out of these lawsuits. So in their agreement to pay out these funds to these 46 states to help them support their Medicaid costs, the master settlement agreement put a stop to individual lawsuits. Like, so this was the master settlement. No more individual lawsuits could be allowed in those states, but in exchange, the tobacco industry was paying out money. In North Carolina, we were one of those 4 states that chose not to participate in this. And basically it was the 4 states that do the most tobacco growing were not a part of this master settlement agreement. Okay, so mortality, again, I don't want you necessarily focusing on raw numbers here. That's really not that important. But I do want you to know that there are deaths every day, and about a death every 8 seconds in the US. We know that the risk of coronary heart disease is 6 times higher in smokers having a heart attack versus non-smokers. The number 1 cause of cancer death, we'll get to this even more when we cover cancer in this class, is lung cancer. So it's the number 1 cause of death, cancer death in women and in men. And So know that. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, this is either emphysema or chronic bronchitis. These are the individuals that their lung functioning is really not working well. They're usually on oxygen, usually they're quite disabled because of their lung disease, and usually very limited in what they can do. And these are individuals with lost productivity. So just like those numbers you saw a little bit ago, these are oftentimes individuals that are not capable of holding down a job. Okay, the house fires. I do want you to know that about 35% of house fires are started from cigarettes. And so we've got an additional danger there. And we've got people who are burned and people who die because of those house fires that are initiated with cigarette smoking. So a person doesn't put their ashtray out, or they fall asleep and they're on their couch or their bed with their cigarette lit and starts the fire. Okay, the involuntary smoking, sometimes called secondhand smoking. I want to talk a little bit about women at risk when women are smokers and pregnancy. And I want to talk about them as smokers. And then I want to talk about these same women if they were not smokers, but they were in a household where another adult was smoking. So to start, women who are cigarette smokers, if they're trying to get pregnant, they're more likely to run into infertility issues, so have more difficulty getting pregnant than women who are non-smokers. That's probably women's body's way of trying to protect them. So more difficulty getting pregnant. They are more likely when they get pregnant to miscarry in first trimester, second trimester, and third trimester. They are more likely to have a stillborn, so a baby that is born full term, that is a dead baby, which is awful. That would be a horrible, horrible thing to have to endure. They are more likely to have a baby in the first year of life if mom smoked during pregnancy, who dies of sudden infant death or SIDS, which is awful, awful, awful for people to lose a baby that way. And then they're more likely to have a child who has a learning disability or ADHD due to mild brain damage. They are more likely to have a child who gets chronic ear infections and has asthma. All of that has been documented in women who smoke during their pregnancy. In part 2 of this lecture, a separate part of this recording, at the very end, you are going to see health department counselors deliberately counseling women who are pregnant, who are smokers, to help them quit smoking. So all this has been documented in these women who are pregnant and smokers. It has also been documented, all of this stuff has been documented to a smaller degree, but still significant degree. The miscarriages, the stillbirth, the sudden infant death, the ADHD, the LD, all that kind of stuff has been documented when the women don't smoke, but they live in a household where they are exposed to secondhand smoke. So the women are getting it secondhand, and then their fetus is getting it secondhand. And so very, very dangerous for pregnant women to smoke or to be around others who smoke. Now, let's talk about the chemicals that are in tobacco smoke. And I get a little flashback from this. I hated chemistry in high school. I had a horrible teacher. And so I see these kinds of things and I'm like, you don't have to memorize all these chemical names. But what I do want you to know is that there are 50 known chemicals that are carcinogens naturally occurring in cigarette smoke. And a carcinogen is a chemical that has the ability to mutate our cell DNA in a way that those cells spin out cancerous cells. Okay, so carcinogens are the chemicals that directly cause cancer. And there are 50 known carcinogens in cigarette smoke. So it's no wonder that individuals who smoke, the most vulnerable part of our body are lungs. That makes sense. Smoke is going to the lungs. After that would be esophageal and cancer, oral cancer in the mouth, which makes sense. That's the input for the cigarette smoke. But technically, we can get cancer in any cell anywhere in our body. And it is known that cigarette smoking creates a vulnerability for all kinds of different cancers in the body. So as an example, there is a bladder cancer that is only seen in cigarette smokers, and it's never seen in people who are non-smokers, as an example. So it's not just lung cancer, it can set up anywhere. Women are more at risk. Well, men get breast cancer too, but women are even more at risk for getting breast cancer if they're cigarette smokers than if they're non-smokers. Okay, so we've talked about the things that happen in the kids, certainly the heart disease and lung cancer death for adults too. Okay, In our epidemiology lecture, we covered Bloom's criteria. And if you recall that if you meet all these criteria versus if you don't have very many of them, that we are very confident and very, very close to an assumption of causality. And we've got all of this when it comes to cigarette smoking and different disease, heart disease, lung cancer. Remember, we talked about relative risk was 10 times higher in a smoker versus a non-smoker. So we've met all of this. The biological plausibility in the tobacco smoke, there's 4,000 plus chemicals that are naturally there, 50 of them known carcinogens. And then if you add to that the fact that naturally occurring in cigarettes is this tar, this dark, sticky, gluey substance. So you take these carcinogens, these chemicals that cause cancer, and they are inhaled into the lungs. And then there's this gluey tar that sticks those chemicals to the lung cells. It's the perfect experiment. It is the perfect experiment to creating cancer. You have glued the cancer-causing chemicals to those healthy cells, once healthy cells, and then they spin out, they mutate DNA and they spin out cancers. Nicotine is a central nervous system stimulant, and it's going to also affect the neurotransmitter substances, that's the NTS in the brain. And it tends to be primary positive reinforcement in the brain. It's primary because it's affecting us on a physiological level. It is positive because you've added something, and then the reinforcement is it feels good, it feels pleasurable in the brain. But it's a perfect mood drug because depending on how a cigarette smoker smokes and how the nicotine arrives in the bloodstream, it can both pick somebody up or bring somebody down. So a cigarette smoker who needs a pick-me-up, if they need energy, they do what I call Dennis Leary style. He used to do stand-up, and he'd walk across the stage and he'd do this like really quick puffing of his cigarette type of thing in his stand-up. That would be the pick-me-up. And that's going to put these bursts of nicotine into the bloodstream, and it tends to feel like, oh yeah, I'm awake. For a person who really needs to calm down as they smoke, and keep in mind, cigarette smokers don't oftentimes even realize this. Imagine a person who's like really upset, who's doing that really long drag, that like, the way that the nicotine arrives in the bloodstream for them can have what feels like a calming effect. But nicotine is a stimulant. It is highly addictive, and it's going to promote cardiovascular disease because the whole cardiovascular system is going to be stimulated and is going to have to work overtime to get enough nutrients and oxygen around to the body, which brings me to carbon monoxide and hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is the molecule that carries oxygen around the body. And oxygen that we need, O2, if we had an O2 and an O1, a carbon monoxide, a 1, if we had, here's hemoglobin, and we have an oxygen and we have a carbon monoxide, hemoglobin has an affinity. It would choose the carbon monoxide over the oxygen, the O2, and carries the carbon monoxide around in the body. So in doing so, the cardiovascular system and every cell in the body that needs this oxygen for energy to make ATP, every cell in the body is getting deprived of oxygen. Okay, so when we start thinking about pregnant women and their babies, and the fact that when they smoke, they tend to have low birth weight babies, which are babies, normal babies about 7 pounds. Low birth weight babies are about 5.5 or less. These are babies that have been full gestation, but they have been deprived of nourishment. They have been deprived of oxygen, which is part of their low birth weight and all the health consequences that they have. OSHA, the Occupational Safety Organization, sets a standard for how much carbon monoxide we can be exposed to in the workplace. The average cigarette smoker is consuming about 8 times that amount of carbon monoxide. When we think about peer influence, we find that, or starting smoking, what's the etiology, what gets people smoking? Most individuals who become smokers do so as kids or teenagers. Peer influence is the #1 reason why kids will begin smoking. So I've got a picture of Beavis and Butthead there because they were always smoking and going, huh, huh, you know, that kind of thing. After peers, it tends to be siblings, but then also keep in mind, so it's usually a peer or a sibling that introduces the cigarette smoking. Parents tend not to introduce cigarette smoking to their kids, but this is very intuitive. If you live in a household where there are 2 adults who are smokers, that kid is a lot more likely to become a smoker. 1 smoker, less likely, but more likely than no adults in the home are smoking, then that kid is a lot less likely to ever become a smoker. The marketing influence, we talked about Joe Camel earlier, has been very clearly targeting teens. And so we get 1 million teens a year, about 3,000 per day start smoking, and we're at about 20% of teenagers smoking right now. The 4+ cigarette rule is what happens there is that for the first few cigarettes that a person tries, kid, adult tries, is awful. I had a aunt who kept me when I was little, when my parents went away at one point, and my aunt ended up dying of smoking related illness. And she had me as a kid choke my way through. So she wasn't trying to get me to start smoking. She was actually trying to show me how awful it was. And it was when she had me smoke this cigarette. It was awful. And she was trying to teach me a lesson of like, don't become like she had become. She was so addicted, she couldn't quit. She was having health consequences. But my point being, nobody smokes their first cigarette and it's like, yay, this feels fantastic, because there's the cough and the irritation and it's horrible. But by time, if you're motivated enough, I wasn't, that one cigarette was all I needed in my life. If you're motivated enough because you want to keep up with your friends and be cool, or your sibling or that kind of thing, and you push your way through to about 4, by about 4, the brain is getting that positive reinforcement that starts to override and feel better than how worse the punishing effects are in the cough and the burning and that type of thing. Once a individual who starts smoking adopts a style, like how they hold their cigarette, once they choose their brand, cigarette smokers are very loyal to their brand. That's part of the reason why advertising is so directed at getting people to pick their brand, because they pick a brand and people will stick with it forever. And then once they acquire an ashtray, a way of disposing of their ashes, at that point in time, they are a smoker. Okay, the biopsychology of this is something I really want us to pay some great attention to here, because cigarette smoking is a physiological addiction and it's a psychological addiction. Those things go hand in hand. So let's talk about this mind-body stuff right now. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to attempt to draw here and give us an example of opponent process. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay. All right, this is time of day. So let's say right here is 7 a.m. in the morning. And let's say right here, this is 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And what we're going to put over here on this axis is heart rate. Heart rate, woo, heart rate. Okay, now average heart rate for humans is, say, about 70 beats per minute. Okay, now what I want to feature, I'm going to use coffee here. We're going to talk about coffee, and because I think you're going to be able to understand this, but everything we're talking about as coffee as a stimulant is exponentially more powerful when it comes to cigarettes as a stimulant. Okay, and this is going to help us understand addiction in a lot of different forms. Okay, so if this is 70 beats per minute, the person who is a non-coffee drinker wakes up, let's say they wake up about 7 a.m., their heart rate's going to fluctuate a little bit throughout the day. All of ours does, no big deal. And but basically they've got a pretty stable heart rate here. Okay. Now what I want to focus on is, let's say we're talking about an individual that drinks 4 cups of coffee in the morning at 7 a.m. to wake up, and tends to drink a cup or 2 around 2 o'clock in the afternoon to give them the afternoon pickup. Got it? So about 4 cups in the morning, about 2 cups in the afternoon. Let me back up for a second though and talk about addiction. Nobody starts out using substances, any kind of substances, heroin, coffee, nicotine. Nobody starts out and goes, I just really want to use a lot all the time and be addicted. What happens is people start using a substance to get a specific effect, whatever the high or the effect is for that substance. We call that effect process A. Got it? Process A. So for coffee, it would be wake me up, give me concentration. For cigarette, it would be kind of that wake me up, give me concentration. For heroin and opioid, it would be relaxed and euphoria kind of thing. And that is the process A. Now, if we use that same substance over and over again, our body will develop this conditioning. So classical conditioning, operant classical, but this conditioning process called opponent process. Get that in your notes. Opponent process. The opponent process is process B. So if A is the high, process B is where our entire physiology goes in the opposite direction. So now I'm going to show you what is happening in the heart rate of a person who wakes up and gets 4 cups at 7 a.m. and then gets a cup or 2 at 2 p.m. So before they're waking up here, their heart rate is in the B process. It is down here in the opponent, the opposite direction of normal. And it takes them, like, let's say they get 3 cups of coffee and they're about here, and then 4 cups of coffee and they're about here. Okay. And then they're kind of going throughout their day, and then, oh, afternoon slump, after lunch, gotta work, gotta think, but feeling bleh. And then they get those 2 cups of coffee and they about come back up to normal. So this here is the opponent process, the B. This here is the process A. So it's the higher the effect of the drug. Okay, so I want to imagine, I want us to kind of look at a time lapse of how this occurs over time. So let's say you're 1 cup of coffee a day. You wake up 7 a.m., get your cup of coffee, you're good. Okay, you've had a lousy night's sleep. You wake up that next morning, you have a cup of coffee, and oh man, I'm dragging here. And then you're like, oh, I need another cup to get going and be able to think straight. So then you do 2 cups of coffee. Okay, and then you feel like, okay, I can get on my day. I've made this process A happen. I can get on with my day. You keep doing that over and over time. You keep increasing the substance over time. The opponent process gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Okay, got it? And the opponent process is explaining tolerance, that the same amount, if used over time, doesn't give you that a process, that good effect that you want. So you use more and more and more and more to get the same effect. It explains craving, because when we are in opponent process, we're in that B process, that is actually withdrawal syndrome. Okay, and withdrawal syndrome is very unpleasant, and it differs depending on the type of substance that we are addicted to. But in process B down here, we are withdrawing and we are craving, and so that person waking up would be like, oh, I got to have my coffee, or oh, I got to have my cigarette. And so opponent process explains so many different things. Now, add to that, there are all kinds of different things that people pair their cigarette smoking to. So in this example, the only thing I've paired is the coffee at 7 a.m. and the coffee at 2 p.m. Okay, that's the only thing I've associated here. And I've used heart rate as one metric of the whole entire physiological process going in the opposite direction. Okay, heart rate's just one thing, but a bunch of stuff is happening. Now, so if you add to that cigarette smokers, like let's say the person always smokes when they're driving, get into the car, ooh, opponent process, ooh, craving, light up a cigarette. If they always during their break at work, go out and hang out with people and have a cigarette, ooh, opponent process, before break, I need my break, I need to go out and smoke my cigarette. Talking on the phone, if they're always smoking while talking on the phone, after eating, after nookie, after sex, all of those kinds of things end up getting classically conditioned and can spur and trigger opponent process, craving, and then lighting up. Got it? Add to that internal sensations, particularly negative emotions. For cigarette smokers, sometimes they even say it's my best friend. Those negative emotions can really cue that opponent process and encourage that person to begin smoking. I want to talk about the stress relief point here, because this is another important point. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you are stressed, when you need to calm down, that you would use a stimulant. You would think you would want a sedative. You would think you would want like a Xanax or an anxiety, or you think you would want alcohol that's a sedative. So it doesn't quite make a whole lot of sense that cigarette smokers will talk about using cigarettes over and over and over again to relieve stress, or to relieve negative emotions, or to relieve anxiety, or to calm down, until you know the paradox. And the paradox is what is actually feeling like stress relief is that right here, when they have used their substance and they come back up to normal, normal feels better than withdrawal. Got it? So it does make sense if their body's going into withdrawal, which feels yucky, and using the substance can relieve that feeling and they go back to normal, they feel better. And so it feels like it's managing stress, but what they're just really doing is over and over and over again ending withdrawal. Another example would be, I don't recommend this, but if you overdo alcohol and you have a hangover the next day, this is how mimosas and Bloody Marys got invented. The best way to end a hangover is to drink more. I don't recommend it because then if you've got that person drinking heavily at night and then you got that person drinking during the day, you're going to be creating all kinds of opponent process. But it's the same kind of idea of ending withdrawal with more of the substance. So ending a hangover with a brunch drink. Don't recommend it. Don't tell your mama I said so. All right, so let me move on to the next slide. Okay, this is going to start part 2. So I am now concluding the video lecture for part 1. And you will need to start on this slide, you will need to listen to part 2. I hope everybody's doing great. See you later. Bye, Health Psych students.